I did my presentation on poverty and learning, how socioeconomic status can impact brain development and hinder academic success. So the relevant research, there's quite a lot, but I mainly focused on certain types of research. So current data on low-income youth in the United States, and a plethora of research studies linking poverty to learning deficits that focused on things like prenatal poverty, neurological impacts relating to learning deficits that are linked to prenatal poverty, childhood poverty, which included a lot of different aspects, such as the home and community environment and language development. So this mainly had to do with the exposure that children had to language and various compounding and mitigating factors that had to do with lifestyle and exposure, learning gaps, access, malnutrition, and sleep deprivation that's related to low socioeconomic status. Areas of the brain involved in poverty and learning. So the areas that are primarily affected were the hippocampus, that had smaller volume of hippocampus, and some studies showed irregular shape. The amygdala, again, smaller volume, and some studies showed irregular shape. And the thalamus, again, a smaller volume and irregular shape. Also, the left superior temporal gyrus and left inferior frontal gyrus came up a few times. That also showed smaller volumes and gray matter density and cortical thickness, especially in the left inferior frontal gyrus. Other areas were also shown to be affected by poverty, including the superior and middle occipital gyrus, parieto-occipital region bilaterally, the right middle frontal and temporal pole regions, and left inferior frontal region and anterior cingulate gyrus. Those all showed smaller local volumes, which seemed to be a theme when we're looking at areas of the brain affected by poverty. Smaller volumes are kind of present across the board. These particular ones are associated mostly with prenatal poverty, meaning that when the student was in utero, their pregnant parent was experiencing poverty. Central nervous system or neural tube development, also associated, of course, in utero. So these are things that occurred during prenatal development, and those are associated with prenatal nutrient deficiencies. There's also effects in the cortical vertices, especially the left middle temporal gyrus, supramarginal gyrus, and anterior cingulate. There are also plasticity differences and deficits shown in students experiencing poverty, especially when it comes to myelination and synaptic pruning. Those are positively correlated with SES. So students of higher socioeconomic status tend to have more effective myelination and synaptic pruning, but our students of lower socioeconomic status have some deficits or less effective myelination and synaptic pruning. So those things obviously have quite a lot of impacts on learning. Some of the main learning gaps that are resulting from poverty and low socioeconomic status are language development. Language development was the most significant one that I found across the research. There's quite a lot of research that has to do with the effects of poverty on language development. So this is the main focus here. Language centers of the brain are impacted by things like prenatal poverty, and this is shown to impact the prenatal development as well as the neonatal brain development after birth up to 24 months. The trajectory of brain growth and development is impacted. And this ends up having some more long-term effects and creates some kind of disparities with different areas of the brain. And they develop at different rates than in a typical child. So insufficient exposure is another thing that impacts language centers, and this can be due to home learning environment, community poverty, that has to do with the family, neighborhood, and schools as well. If it's school-wide poverty, has pretty profound effects on these learning gaps and deficiencies. Language and literacy gaps that are not addressed. So students experiencing poverty often enter schools with language and literacy deficits. If unaddressed, language and literacy gaps tend to widen as the student gets older. Memory is also impacted. I mentioned earlier the hippocampus, amygdala, and also the frontoparietal network. These are all things that are impacted and interfere with aspects of memory storage and meaning making. These impact the student's ability to convert working memory to long-term memory, and can also impact the student's social, emotional, and spatial awareness that contribute to their ability to commit experiences to working memory. To long-term memory. Cognitive performance and control are also impacted. So that can happen due to physiological impacts of the brain that can be congenital, as we discussed with prenatal poverty, developmental, and circumstantial. Those three often kind of piggyback on each other, compound each other. Circumstantial situations can be things like sleep, nutrition, and exposure. And social and emotional impacts on the brain and cognition also come into play here. Spatial reasoning is also impacted here. As I mentioned a little bit with memory, spatial reasoning is shown to be affected by some of the areas of the brain that are seen in some of these studies. I did not go into detail of spatial reasoning in my research, but I did come across it a couple times. Big point here. Important point for educators. Many of the developmental delays and the neurological damage that are often experienced by lower socioeconomic students and students experiencing poverty have been shown in multiple studies in recent years to be capable of improvement or even reversible with the proper support and interventions. So, let's work on improving or even reversing some of these. What can we do to mitigate or reverse these delays and the damage that are experienced by a lot of our students experiencing poverty? Here's how we can apply it to the classroom. Closing those gaps and ensuring success for low SES students includes things like early intervention. Early intervention is the first step to closing these learning gaps. So, early intervention can include focused language and literacy intervention in your classroom. Things like one-to-one support and small group support really come in handy with early intervention. Also, heterogeneous grouping, gives your students exposure to various learning levels, exposure to language use, and allows them to learn from other students. Immersion in a language-rich environment. That means that we are including language-rich activities into our curriculum and creating a language-rich environment throughout the school year. Which brings us to a language-rich classroom. Regular interactions among students in a classroom setting. So make sure that those regular interactions are embedded into your curriculum. And frequent use of language by students in the classroom. So teachers should not just be the only one talking. Students should be using language regularly. Language should be heard, read, used, modeled, and understood. And use those language scaffolds to support your students as necessary. Next thing is to create a positive learning environment. So we saw earlier effects on the amygdala and the hippocampus, which work very intricately together. Positive learning environment supports healthy functioning of that amygdala and its communication with the hippocampus. So creating a safe environment where a student feels comfortable and safe learning and being around their peers and teacher. Supporting a growth mindset, so students feel comfortable growing and learning from their errors, failures, mistakes. And engaging, stimulating, and relevant lessons. These all help that amygdala. Aerobic exercise has been shown to increase hippocampal volume. So incorporating exercise into the school day, whether that's in your classroom or elsewhere on campus, can help them with their hippocampus. And a focus on health. Teach and model healthy sleep and nutrition habits for your students. Provide nutritious meals for students. That can be on your school site or district. Don't impede on sleep and nutrition opportunities, which means avoid excessive homework that might interfere with their ability to get a full night's sleep. And later school start times. So talk to your school or district about considering later school start times for your students. 1 in 5 children in 2021 are experiencing poverty. That number has generally been around 1 in 6, but this has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. You will most likely have students in your classroom experiencing poverty. Help them close the gap, achieve success, and break the cycle.